Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my prediction for the upcoming death battle between Raven and Twilight Sparkle. In this video, I will be going over the characters' backstories, their powers and capabilities, why these characters were paired against each other, and then finally, who I think is going to win. As for what I researched for this match, for Raven I covered all of her comics as well as the more impressive feats from the Teen Titans cartoon. For Twilight Sparkle, I covered the first 5.5 seasons of the show as well as a large chunk of the comics, at which point I ran out of time. Even so, I am still fairly confident regarding who I think is going to win. As always, if you want to debate, I am all ears, but I expect evidence to support your arguments. With all that said, let's get into it. First up is Raven, the daughter of Trigon and mistress of mysticism. Raven's origin is pretty straightforward, more or less. She is the half-breed daughter of a human woman from Earth and an interdimensional demon called Trigon. Trigon wanted his daughter to rule by his side as part of his plan to enter our universe and conquer it. But Raven's mother had other plans. She spirited Raven away to a place called Azarath. Azarath was a magical place that existed between dimensions, and it was home to a collection of wise mystic priests. These mystics decided to aid Raven's mother and take her in so that way Raven could be taught the ways of good instead of evil. In her training there, Raven was taught how to manifest and utilize the magical powers she wields as part of her demonic heritage. However, she was also taught to suppress all her emotions because if she were to ever allow herself to feel too much emotion, she would run the risk of awakening her demonic side and turning evil. And once she turned evil, she would provide Trigon with the very pathway he needed to invade this dimension. Raven realized that she would eventually lose control, so she set a plan in motion to stop Trigon and herself when she eventually joined the dark side. This plan consisted of her gathering together a select group of heroes, all of whom carried unique capabilities that would be crucial in defeating Trigon. Once these heroes were brought together, they became the new Teen Titans. Over time, this group, including Raven, battled many great threats, but their original purpose across the years has remained the same. They are to protect the world from Trigon and from Raven if need be. They battled and bested Trigon many times, but Trigon isn't the sort to stay dead for long. In addition, Raven has turned evil many times as well, and every time Raven has been defeated and usually killed. However, like her father, Raven doesn't stay dead for long either. Every time her body has been destroyed, Raven's soul inevitably found new bodies to inhabit. After resurrection, Raven goes back to fight for good until she falls prey to the dark side all over again. This has remained the core of Raven's story to this very day. That's Raven's origin story. Now let's talk about what she can do. Raven utilizes magic, in combination with some powers she inherited from her father, to fight her battles. These powers were made intentionally vague by the writers so that they could effectively invent new powers for her when they saw fit. Thankfully, they have since solidified exactly what it is she can do. The official DC website sums it up quite well. Raven is extremely powerful, gifted with magical, psychic, and telekinetic powers, as well as the ability to manipulate energy, emotion, and shadows. Let's break this down piece by piece. Raven's primary tool throughout the majority of her career has been her ability to sense and manipulate emotions. Raven is an empath, which means she can feel what the people around her can feel. This allows her to guess a number of things about one's goals and thoughts, and if she can get her hands on you, she can do far more, and even invade your mind. Using her empath abilities, she can even plague a target's mind with illusions. She can do this even more easily when she uses her soul self. Raven's soul self is, well, Raven's soul, which she can launch out of her body. Yes, she actually launches her soul at people as an attack. And if it gets its hands on you, it can do a number of different things. She can more easily mess with your mind, she can teleport you across the world or into another dimension, it can ram into you to deal physical damage, or she can draw you inside the soul self, which actually contains a pocket dimension. Some other powers of the Soul Self is that it can envelop Raven and act as a force field, it can grant Raven high-speed flight, it allows her to instantly teleport to anywhere on the globe or into another dimension, it makes her immune to illness, it allows her to heal her own injuries, and it can move and act even if Raven is knocked unconscious, provided that the Soul Self is outside of her when she was knocked out. The Soul Self can manifest as several separate avatars that can do battle, and thanks to her demonic heritage, the Soul Self is resistant to hellfire. And while the Soul Self can be shattered or broken with enough power, doing so does no permanent damage to Raven herself, although it does cause a lot of pain. That's her Soul Self and Empath abilities. Now for Raven's second most iconic power, her telekinetic shadow magic. This ability was very rarely used in the comics, but it's Raven's bread and butter ability in the Teen Titans cartoon. Using this allows Raven to perform magical telekinesis. It's that simple. Her most impressive use of this ability came from the show. At one point, Raven was being chased by a demonically enhanced Slade because plot. And to try and stop his pursuit, Raven closed the alley he was in by slamming together the two adjacent buildings. Both of these buildings were over 7 stories tall, which means that they would have had to weigh thousands of tons each. Last but not least is Raven's magic. Now, Raven's magic is not used very often, and its abilities and limitations are highly inconsistent and vague. But I'll try and cover what I know. Raven has occasionally had prophetic dreams, she has magical senses that let her detect souls and stuff, and most suspiciously, Raven once in the Teen Titans show stopped time. Now, I am very skeptical of this supposed ability. Raven never used this ability before, never used it again, and most importantly, never used this ability once in the comics, which are the main canon. So, since this power has such dubious canonicity, and since Raven only used it once by complete accident and never used it again, I won't be weighing it too heavily in my judgment. Anyway, Raven doesn't really use equipment, but she does have a jewel in the middle of her forehead, which she uses to focus her powers. Also, Raven isn't really a hand-to-hand fighter, but should it come down to it, Raven has been trained in martial arts. It's now important to discuss Raven's evil form. Should Raven succumb to her dark side, she gains access to more raw power at the cost of less self-control. Generally speaking, her abilities remain the same, they just have more raw power behind them. Unfortunately, there isn't much in terms of feats regarding Evil Raven, as she doesn't show up very often. There was one time when Evil Raven was around for a while, and she performed some notable feats at the time, but it was later revealed that this was not actually Raven, it was really the evil souls of Azeroth disguised as Raven. Unfortunate. That's it for abilities, now let's look at her base stats. First up is strength. Raven isn't really a strength character. It seems she has a small degree of superhuman strength, which is to say that the one time she engaged in martial arts, she sent her foes flying farther than a normal human would. But even then, that's not that much. By and large, strength is just not Raven's strong suit. Next is speed. Now, without her powers, Raven only has base human speed. But with her powers, Raven has drastically increased mobility. Her soul self in particular can move at very high speeds. It once traversed 1,000 miles in a matter of minutes. Now, depending on how you interpret in a matter of minutes, this can mean the soul self was traveling anywhere from 6,000 miles per hour to 20,000 miles per hour. Of course, even that pales in comparison to Raven's best means of movement, her instantaneous teleportation. Raven can teleport anywhere on Earth instantly, and in Death Battle, they hold that instant teleportation trumps speed. So, that's pretty handy. In terms of durability, again, Raven without her powers is only ever so slightly superhuman. In the aforementioned fight scene in which she employed martial arts, she tanks some hits that sent her flying farther than any human blow could have achieved. However, with her powers, Raven's defense goes up significantly. Utilizing her soul self as a force field allows Raven to tank the impacts of several high-speed cars, explosions, or lasers. And should Raven suffer harm, she can utilize her empath abilities to heal her wounds. In terms of intelligence, Raven typically relies on her brainier teammates for strategy, but she is decent at planning on her own. In terms of particular combat feats, Raven has bested groups of armed soldiers time and time again. She once banished a swarm of demons straight to hell, and when she goes evil mode, she can even give the Teen Titans a run for their money. Unfortunately, that's about it in terms of her combat feats, as Raven generally acts as more of a medic than a fighter. But make no mistake, the daughter of Trigon is not to be underestimated. Now let's talk weaknesses. Strap in, cause Raven has a lot to talk about here. First off, Raven's mediocre base stats make her highly vulnerable. Anytime an enemy successfully gets in close, Raven typically gets one shot. Ultimately, Raven's body is mostly human, which means that she more or less has the same vulnerabilities as any other person. And while her soul self can act as a shield, it can only endure so much before it breaks, and while breaking it doesn't do any major damage to Raven, it does disable most of her powers and pretty much knocks her out of the fight. And while the soul self is pretty effective against physical attacks, it has a much harder time blocking energy or magic-based attacks. In addition, Raven's heritage as a half-demon makes her highly vulnerable to holy and light-based magic. Just being around a user of such powers hurts Raven, and can even destabilize her own powers. And while Raven can heal herself if need be, this doesn't happen automatically, and requires her complete focus. And even then, it often takes a while for the healing to complete, and truly fatal wounds are beyond her ability to repair. Raven's empath abilities are useful, but they come with a whole slew of issues. Because she can sense and feel the emotions of those around her, she can be overwhelmed if the emotions are too numerous or intense. Simply killing someone near Raven can cause her excruciating pain. Furthermore, while Raven can screw with people's minds if given the chance, she can be resisted and overcome by people wielding their own form of magic, or just those with strong wills. Speaking of which, while Raven fares decently against physical threats, she often struggles against magical ones, as Raven herself relies far more heavily on her empath and telekinetic abilities than she does on her magic. For example, Raven's time-stopping ability didn't even work on Slade at the time because he was powered up by demonic magic. Raven's little jewel on her head is also a liability, because Raven relies upon it quite heavily to control her powers. Should it be removed or destroyed, she becomes quite helpless. Also, Raven's mental fortitude is dubious at best. She has been brainwashed and brought over to the dark side more times than I can count, and she always requires massive amounts of outside help in order to recover. Speaking of outside help, Raven has spent almost the entirety of her superhero career on the Teen Titans, meaning she is very used to having a team supporting her during combat. This is a vulnerability since she won't have her team for this death battle. Furthermore, Raven never was the muscle of the team. She actually spent the majority of her career as the team medic, and even when she engaged in combat, she usually just used her empath abilities to lull the enemy into a peaceful slumber. And while Raven's evil form is more capable of destruction, it has still been bested by the Teen Titans time and time again, and while this form has more power, it loses out on self-control. Furthermore, Raven's evil side is the physical embodiment of pride. Which isn't flowery language, she is literally the physical manifestation of a deadly sin. And as is to be expected of the embodiment of pride, evil Raven is arrogant to a fault. In short, while Raven has a lot going on, she also has a lot going against her. That's everything I know about Raven. Now let's look at Twilight Sparkle, the embodiment of magic and princess of friendship. This story is a bit of a doozy. This is the pony-controlled land of Equestria, and here magic reigns supreme. All ponies are imbued with magic, and this allows them to achieve feats far beyond that of your standard horse. There are actually 3 types of ponies in Equestria. There are the Earth ponies, the Pegasi, and the Unicorns. The Earth ponies have increased physical capabilities, making them the strongest and toughest of all ponies. Then there's the Pegasi, who have the power of flight and enhanced speed, granting them the greatest mobility of all ponies. And last but certainly not least are the Unicorns, who have vast magical powers. However, there is one very special group of ponies who reign over them all, and they are called Alicorns. Or maybe it's Alicorns. I'm not entirely sure. These entities are very few in number and have the powers of all the 3 main types of ponies, meaning that they have a horn, wings, and super stats. They also tend to wield godlike powers. One such example of an alicorn is the immortal ruler of Equestria known as Celestia. Celestia is, for all intents and purposes, the sun god, as the sun bends to her every whim, and she's, immortal. She is an eternal beacon of inspiration for her subjects, including a young unicorn called Twilight Sparkle. Twilight was so inspired by the sight of Celestia raising the sun that she decided to devote her entire life to the study of magic. She studied tirelessly until such time as she was ready to take the entrance exam for Celestia's School for Gifted Unicorns. Twilight was tasked with using her magic to hatch a dragon egg, and she was just about to fail the exam when an explosive sonic rain booms roared across the sky, which startled Twilight into completing the spell. At that very moment, Twilight's cutie mark appeared. A cutie mark is a magical symbol that appears on a pony's side when they discover their calling in life, and Twilight's calling was magic. However, as her cutie mark appeared, Twilight was overwhelmed by a massive surge of magical energy that started to run amok. She transformed her parents into houseplants, turned the baby dragon into a giant dragon, and levitated the judges giving the test. All this madness attracted the attention of none other than Celestia herself. Celestia's appearance was enough to calm Twilight down and undo the magic she unleashed. Celestia was very impressed with the sheer amount of magical talent Twilight possessed, so in order to help her learn to control these abilities, Celestia took Twilight on as her own personal protege. Twilight was, of course, ecstatic. Not only was she getting to learn magic, but she was actually being taught by her personal hero. Twilight would spend the next chunk of her life fervently studying and improving her magical abilities until one fateful day when Celestia gave Twilight the most important mission of her life. Twilight was to go to a nearby village called Ponyville, where she was to study the magic of friendship. Twilight was, understandably, not very thrilled by this task, as it didn't seem likely to help her magic studies in the slightest, but she went anyway. While there, Twilight did in fact start making some very good friends, but the fun was cut short with the appearance of the evil moon goddess known as Nightmare Moon, who planned to plunge the entire world into eternal darkness. The only way to beat her was for Twilight and her friends to acquire a set of magical artifacts known as the Elements of Harmony. Twilight and her friends found these artifacts and discovered that they were actually powered by friendship. At this point, it's important to explain a very crucial concept in My Little Pony. When they say friendship is magic, they don't just mean friendship is great. They literally mean friendship equals magic. As in, increasing one's friendship directly boosts the amount of mystical power one has. When Celestia tasked Twilight with studying friendship, she was actually tasking her with studying the greatest source of mystical power on the planet. Realizing the power of friendship, Twilight and her friends were able to wield the Elements of Harmony and defeat Nightmare Moon, turning her back into a good moon goddess known as Princess Luna. Twilight would then permanently reside in Ponyville, where she continued to improve her magic while deepening her friendships. Many dark and powerful threats have challenged Equestria over Twilight's career, but with the power of friendship on her side, nothing is ever proven too much for her. After successfully defending Equestria and accomplishing many great feats, Twilight was given the greatest reward of all. She was transformed from a mere unicorn into an alicorn. This boosted her physical stats, granted her wings for flight, and gave her even greater mystical power. She was also granted the title of Princess, elevating her to the status of peers with Celestia herself. With even greater power in hand, Twilight has continued to spearhead the cause of spreading the gift of friendship all across the land. That's Twilight's story, now let's look at what she can do. Twilight's bread and butter is her massive trove of magical spells. Her most commonly used ability is her magical telekinesis. Twilight has accomplished a number of impressive feats with this power. When a dam ruptured, she was able to levitate all the pieces of the dam back into place and completely reseal the rupture. At another point, she was able to levitate a water tower filled with water, and she levitated a giant bear at the same time. She then transported them across an entire town. By my rough estimates, the bear and water tower could weigh around 136 tons. And last but not least, in a fit of rage, Twilight once blasted her library/house around 200 feet into the air. Now, the exact weight and structure of this building is hard to judge. By my very rough estimates, it could weigh anywhere between 50 and 500 tons. Combine that with how high into the air the building was launched, and this is a pretty crazy feat. Outside of telekinesis, Twilight's other most common ability is her instantaneous teleportation. With this, Twilight can teleport across an entire town or in rapid succession. She can even cast this ability on an enemy in order to teleport them wherever she wants. Next up, Twilight can fire laser beams out of her horn that can hit with quite a bit of force. They are powerful enough to slice through solid rock, cut down trees, and even slice through a thick matting of giant monster spider silk, which, as you may recall, has tensile strength stronger than steel. Also, while in a battle with the Changeling Queen, Twilight fired an energy blast so powerful that it blasted a 30-foot wide hole in the stone wall of a castle. Those are Twilight's most commonly used magics, but she has a whole trove of spells at her disposal. She has transmogrify spells, which let her turn a target into any number of different objects and/or animals. She has an age spell, which lets her make the target grow older or younger. She has a variety of barriers she can cast to protect her from magical and physical attacks. She has a spell that, when cast on an object, makes all who see the object obsessively dedicate themselves to acquiring said object. She has a spell that lets her enter a target's mind, a spell that lets her enter into the world of a book, a spell that lets her dispel other magic, and a spell that lets her take away the magical abilities of her opponents. She has a spell that dispels the illusion magic of changelings, a spell that lets her create fire, a spell that lets her launch evil laser beams, a spell that destroys magical clones, a spell that lets the target phase through matter, and a spell that lets her conjure a parasprite, a monstrous little creature that devours everything it can get its mouth on while multiplying itself endlessly. She has a spell that grants her active camouflage, a spell that lets her remote control people, a variety of spells for manipulating gravity, a spell that froze an entire army, a spell that encases a target in ice, and a spell that boosts her speed. Outside of her spells, Twilight has a condensed spellbook that she can conjure into existence, and she has the Armor of Friendship, which grants her the power to see through illusions. And the absolute last thing we must discuss regarding Twilight's powers are the elements of harmony. Originally, the elements were physical artifacts that they kept nearby in case some monster attacked, but recently the elements were upgraded into rainbow power, which granted Twilight and friends a Super Saiyan sort of transformation which boosted their power immeasurably. Now, it's unclear if Twilight can access this power at any time or not, but in Death Battle, if there's a super-powered transformation that the character may have access to, they typically give it to them. This transformation allowed Twilight and friends to defeat Tyrek, a demonic entity who had devoured the magic of every pony in Equestria, including all the other alicorns, making him practically a god. So, in short, rainbow power is a big deal. Even by herself, Twilight with rainbow power is a dangerous opponent. That's it for abilities, now let's cover base stats. First is strength. Early in her career, Twilight was able to carry this boulder around for an extended period of time, which I roughly estimate to weigh around 9.5 tons. But Twilight's best strength feat comes from after she became an alicorn, in which Twilight, with the aid of one other alicorn, was able to pull a solid gold chariot through the skies. Assuming Twilight was pulling her fair share, this would mean she is moving 43.4 tons. In terms of speed, Twilight herself is only about as fast as any other pony, but with her speed spell activated, Twilight can fly so fast that she can even create a sonic rainbow, putting her speed at Mach 10, or 7,673 miles per hour. That's pretty good, but since Twilight can teleport instantaneously across a city, that sort of speed isn't particularly necessary. In terms of durability, Twilight is quite tough. Early on in her career, Twilight survived a flower pot, an anvil, a cart filled with hay bales, and a grand piano falling squarely on her head, and she walked it off like it was nothing 10 seconds later. Another crazy durability feat came when Pinkie Pie pulled out a cartoonishly massive megaphone and screamed through it so loud that the hills and mountains miles away bent in the wind. Twilight was standing right next to Pinkie Pie, and aside from a minor case of deafness, was unharmed. Combined with her various magical barriers, Twilight is quite difficult to kill. In terms of intelligence, Twilight is a textbook genius. She is obsessed with reading, which has made her quite familiar with a wide range of topics. She is a complete master of magic, to the point that she has even taken on her own pupil. And lastly, Twilight is the leader of the main 6 heroes, and she is the primary strategist of the group. With her vast knowledge and power, there are few problems Twilight Sparkle cannot solve. In terms of particular combat feats, Twilight was, with the aid of her friends, able to best the likes of Nightmare Moon, Discord, and Tyrek. By herself, Twilight is widely considered the best magic user in Ponyville, and she even managed to best the Changeling Queen in a magical duel. If that wasn't enough, she once even froze an entire army with one spell. Needless to say, the Princess of Friendship is someone you want to have on your side. Now let's talk weaknesses. Twilight's biggest flaw is that she really isn't a warrior by nature. She's a bookworm and a sorceress, but she's not a soldier, and while she's had her fair share of fights at this point, it's certainly not something that she spends the majority of her time doing. In addition, while Twilight is powerful, all of her most impressive feats required the aid of her friends, who she will not have access to in this death battle. And due to her spending all her time reading, Twilight is not as strong or as fast as some of the other ponies. Not to mention that Twilight relies quite heavily on magic, and that magic stems from her horn. Should something happen to the horn, she would lose her magic, although it is worth noting that she has access to the power of friendship regardless of the state of her magic or horn. Also, Twilight has been known to over-obsess when trying to solve problems, to the point that she misses the more obvious answers. And that's everything I know about these characters. Before I get to my prediction, here's all their similarities and or reasons for the matchup. 1. Both utilize magic to grant themselves very similar powers. 2. Both are kinda sort of princesses. 3. Both have played major roles in bringing their teams together. 4. Both have battled dark gods and magical monsters. 5. Both care about their friends above all else. And 6. Both are voiced by Tara Strong. That's all the reasons for the match. Now for my prediction. I think the winner of this death battle will be Twilight Sparkle. This was not a particularly difficult match to call. I didn't really know much about either of these characters when I started my research, and frankly, I don't really love either of them. I'm not a fan of comics in general, and I probably wouldn't call myself a fan of My Little Pony, so I actually don't think there's too much bias going on in my conclusion here. By and large, from what I can see, Twilight seems to take almost every category. Let's bring up the checklist. Starting with strength, Raven is barely even superhuman, whereas Twilight has moved over 40 tons. Moving to speed, they're about the same. Both of them can use their magic to move pretty fast, but since both can instantly teleport, their movement around the battlefield is going to be pretty much the same. In terms of durability, I have to give it to Twilight. Without any form of magic or upgrade, she was able to shake off hits that would have killed Raven outright, and while both of them can boost their defenses via magic, Twilight's Pinkie Pie Mountain feat trumps anything Raven has endured. Furthermore, while Twilight's defensive barriers have protected her quite effectively from magical attacks, Raven's defensive barriers have proven far less reliable. When Raven battles other types of magical foes, she usually struggles to block their attacks, even with her soul self. So, both in general and in this matchup, Twilight has the more consistent and well-rounded durability. In terms of their arsenal, both of them utilize magical telekinesis, and in this one respect, Raven does have an edge. Her movement of 2 buildings trumps anything Twilight has probably done. However, this is just one aspect of their magic. Outside of telekinesis, Twilight absolutely dominates. Not only does she have more effective means of directly attacking thanks to her laser beams, but she also has a far more easy time manipulating Raven than Raven has manipulating her. Twilight's armor of friendship, combined with her various means of draining and dispelling magic, makes most of Raven's magical and illusionary techniques useless, whereas Raven has little to no defense against some of Twilight's more tricky magics, such as her spell that makes whoever sees an object obsess over it. Once Raven is focused on said object, she'll likely let her guard down, which, thanks to her pathetic base durability, means she's pretty much doomed. Not to mention, even though Raven has better telekinesis than Twilight, Twilight's ability to drain and dispel enemy magic makes her perfectly prepared to nullify that advantage. So, in terms of the primary stats, Twilight takes almost all of them. That said, let's take a look at their secondary stats just to fully prove my argument. In terms of skill, it's very close, but once again Twilight pulls ahead. Both have trained with godlike entities to increase their potency on and off the battlefield, and both of them have fought alongside super teams. But Twilight takes the lead thanks to the fact that she spends every free moment she has learning. Whether she's studying to become better at magic or studying any number of other subjects, Twilight becomes more and more capable every single day, whereas the same cannot be said of Raven. While she does improve gradually over time, it's a minor improvement at best. You'd think that Raven's superior combat experience would be worth something, but in actuality, Raven very rarely engaged in legitimate combat during her missions with the Teen Titans. The majority of the time, she just hung back and acted as the team's medic. As such, any potential opportunity to improve in the fires of warfare were pretty much lost. Not to mention, I never saw Raven training once in the entirety of my research. Some of the other Teen Titans would train, but I have no memory of Raven ever joining in. Combine that with the sheer number of spells Twilight has learned, and I think it's pretty clear who is the more devoted to improving their capabilities. In terms of stamina, it's a little less clear, but I think Twilight's durability pretty much decides this advantage as well. Both of them have a limited amount of spellcasting they can do before they're drained, but Raven can only last as long as she doesn't get hit. Once she takes a hit, she's out, whereas Twilight can tank some pretty heavy hits and keep on trucking. In terms of intelligence, it isn't even a contest. Raven has never stood out in this department, and generally speaking, she tends to rely on her smarter teammates to come up with strategies. By contrast, Twilight is the most knowledgeable and tactical pony on her team, and her status as a protege scholar and master of magic easily solidifies her as a genius. As such, she quite easily takes this category. In terms of versatility, it once again quite clearly goes to Twilight. Her vast knowledge and huge array of spells gives her far more options in terms of how she wishes to pursue her battles. There's nothing Raven can do that Twilight doesn't have some means of matching or countering. And in terms of mobility, again, they're pretty much the same. Both can move at high speeds and teleport. That's about as even as it gets. Regardless, once again we see that Twilight takes the majority of these categories. And before we wrap this up, there are two major topics I want to cover, and that is weaknesses and transformations. In terms of weaknesses, Raven is an absolute mess. Her vulnerability to light magic is particularly bad for this matchup, since Twilight is literally powered by friendship. That's about as light as it gets. I mean, bringing shadow magic to fight someone who wields light is pretty clearly a bad choice. By contrast, Twilight has battled dark magic time and time again. Actually, Raven in general has a hard time dealing with other magic users, to the point that her soul self has been one-shot and shattered by magic more times than I can count. Also, while both of them rely on their friends, Raven is far more dependent on her team to best foes than Twilight is on hers. Raven is generally just the medic, and she usually relies on her teammates to provide the muscle and the brains necessary to take down the various villains that they face. More often than not, when Raven tries to subdue the villain by herself, she gets decimated. By contrast, while Twilight is at her best when she has her friends, she is their leader for a reason. She is decisive, intelligent, and powerful, making her much more well-rounded and far less dependent on her team. In addition, the whole premise of the power of friendship is that they are giving her more power just by being friends with her. Twilight is far more powerful and capable as an individual now than she was before she made her friends. In other words, Twilight making her friends and joining her team actually made her less dependent on others. Also, Twilight just doesn't have nearly as many exploitable weaknesses as Raven, and the few vulnerabilities Twilight does have, she can pretty easily make up for with her magic. In terms of transformations, Twilight's is simply far superior. Utilizing the power of friendship allows her and her team to take on godlike entities who are capable of warping reality and conquering planets. By contrast, evil Raven is more powerful and vicious than regular Raven, but she isn't so much more powerful that Twilight couldn't handle her. Quite frankly, evil Raven is so lacking in feats that any boost she may get from this transformation is pretty vague. Also, falling back even further on the demon power is only going to make Raven even more vulnerable to Twilight's light magic. And realistically, the few times evil Raven has shown up, she has been pretty promptly bested and usually killed by the Teen Titans. If they could do it without exploiting any of her major weaknesses, then Twilight, who is the physical embodiment of everything Raven is weak to, is likely going to take her down as well. In short, I believe that Twilight's superior base stats, far vaster arsenal, and less exploitable weaknesses are going to win her this fight. As such, I'd say I'm a solid 80% sure that Twilight Sparkle is going to win this death battle. This was, ironically enough, less painful to research than Batman vs. Black Panther. I had never really seen much about the Teen Titans in my past research sessions, so this was interesting to check out, and I'd also been curious about My Little Pony for some time. I wouldn't say I'm a fan of MLP, but I can see why others are. It has effort and quality put into it, even if it's not my cup of tea. Regardless, that's just about everything I have to say about this matchup. As for the pun, I really have no clue. I guess I'll go with, looks like Twilight was the more titanic foe. Ha. Like if you enjoyed the video, comment if you got something to say, subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, have a fantastic day.